This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and we have a great topic for today, one that is on the top of everyone's mind, every company's mind and board's mind these days, and that is cybersecurity and the board. And with me to do justice to this topic, let me introduce Russell Schrader, who's the Chief Privacy Officer and Associate General Counsel of Global Enterprise Risk for Visa. Welcome, Russell.
Thank you very much.
Corporate Board Member and FTI Consulting just finished their annual legal study, and in that we send that to both directors and to GCs. And one of the questions that we ask in that study is, what are your biggest concerns for 2013? And interestingly enough, data security and cyber risk was the number one issue for not only the GCs, but also for the board of directors. So my first question is, does that sort of results coincide with what you're seeing among your chief privacy officer associates?
Absolutely. Cybersecurity and data security is first and foremost about trust. A board and management want to know that the data that they have is protected, that there's data integrity, and that they can rely upon and trust the data that they have. Also, if they're working for consumers, their customers, the people who are their stakeholders also want to be able to trust the data that a company has so that they can rely on it. But once you have that trust and once you have that reputation, you have to make sure that you live up to it, that your data is in fact secure and that you are doing things that you need to do to manage your cyber risk. There really is no silver bullet when it comes to managing data security and cyber risk. It's constantly shifting, it's constantly moving. You have very sophisticated hackers, and you need to have very sophisticated defenses. It's not enough, for example, merely to look at your perimeter safety. You need to have layers within. You need to constantly be reacting to the nature of the threat in order to keep those that very precious IP, customer data, employee data, health data, financial data, strategic plan data, all secure and where it should be. And when you try to do that, I think management and board has realized that everyone has a role to play. It's very much a shared responsibility. And you need to reach out across the board, not just to your intellectual property people, not to the lawyers, not to the engineers, but each employee and stakeholder and contractor has a role to play to keep your data secure and safe.
Well, the challenge with this versus many risks is you don't know what you don't know. I mean, somebody is out there dreaming up something new probably every minute, going forward. And as devices proliferate and processes, people want to have connectivity, it creates an unbelievable challenge.
It is a challenge, but there's also a tremendous benefit. The idea that you have a lot of different devices that can plug in increases productivity. It means that you can contact and share data and information. You have more collaboration. You could have more innovation. There are tremendous values to that kind of openness. You just have to make sure that it's secure and that you know what you're getting into. It's quite true that the international threat, the increased sophistication of hackers has really picked up speed. And the board and senior management picks up the paper. They read the newspaper. They read about, the Mondia threat in China. They read about data security breaches in the U.S. They read about the president putting out a cybersecurity executive order. So they realize that this is a very high, persistent area of concern that they need to address within their own company.
Well, being Visa, you have the responsibility of protecting millions of credit card records and transactions and everything that happens, and you're battling against the most sophisticated global hackers, that exist. Share with our audience a little bit about how that's sort of evolved in the last 5 years and how that's changed maybe the conversations that you've had both internally with your other department heads and then subsequently with the board of directors.
Sure. One of the biggest and most important things is to have a plan and realize that that plan must be flexible. It needs to be adaptable. It needs to have very high goals. It needs to have very clear goals. And you need to really map against it how you can look at that plan and be able to react and anticipate, frankly, when you can, the kind of international sophisticated threats that you have. And we try to move that throughout the whole visa system. As you pointed out, there are a lot of financial institutions and merchants as well. Very sophisticated merchants, very sort of mom and pop grocery stores, all accept Visa cards. And we came up with the multi-stakeholder process of the payment card industry data security standards, the so-called PCI DSS. And that's a very good tool that, frankly, even if you're not a card acceptor, to look to for a benchmark. It's scalable and it's addressable in a lot of different areas, and it gives you an idea of the kinds of things a general counsel, a board, an executive management needs to think about for their own company and adapt them and to use them as best they can.
Well, on the show, we always try and give good content to our board members that are faithful watchers. So I'm going to ask you to put on a different hat. I'm going to ask you for the moment to pretend that you're on the board of directors. What questions would you be asking as a board of your IT guru or your security officer or your CPO to give you comfort as a director that they were on top of this?
Okay, that's a great question. Part of it, the first thing you want to say is, all right, have you done your SWOT analysis, your strength, your weakness, your opportunity, your threats? All right. Have you identified the problem? All right, fine. What's your plan? How are you going to deal with them? Who are you going to pull in? Have you updated it so that when people come and go, you go into a new business, that you've already brought that in together? All right, so you've got that. Terrific. When was the last time you tested it? Even if it's just a tabletop, you really need to say it's not just a piece of paper or a few bits hidden off, that it's a living document that you go through and you test. It's not dissimilar, frankly, to business continuity. If you were hit by Superstorm Sandy, if you were hit by an earthquake or a hurricane or a power blackout, how would you react? It's the same thing. You really need to take a look at how do you deal with these kinds of cyber threats that are coming through. And you just sort of tease it out. Then I would ask, okay, how are your peer contacts? Do you know what the similar companies are doing? Are you out there at industry conferences? Are you talking to others in your area in a similar space to find out, okay, what do they hear? And frankly, that kind of information sharing is exactly what the President is trying to encourage with his executive order and what's been talked about in Congress. How do we share this information? Because a cyber threat will not just attack one company. They're looking at a broad range of industries all across the world. So there are tremendous benefits to that kind of networking and peer sharing. And finally, you want to say, all right, how are you dealing with the international scene? Are you finding out what kind of threats there are in other countries, not just the U.S.? And how are you working with government agencies, whether it's the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security in the U.S., or others, in order to deal with the true international threat that comes with cybersecurity?
I'll add one more question to that, and that's if do you have a crisis plan in place if you do have a breach on how you're going to handle that? You don't want to be making that up on the fly on that. So the board member, that is good. That's some great advice. I hope people took notes on that because there were some good questions there. So finally, I want to ask you, Russ, when you look ahead, I'll ask you to look in your crystal ball now. When you look ahead, what are the things that sort of encourage you when you look into future, and what are the things that sort of concern you?
Okay. They almost work in tandem. One of the things that absolutely is concerning is the increased sophistication of the hackers. The amount of equipment, the amount of manpower, the amount of trained workforce that they can put into hacking, it's a full-time, very lucrative business for some of them. So that's very concerning. At the same time, though, in the U.S. and elsewhere, we are training an increasingly sophisticated cyber workforce to help us create the countervailing tools, to help us build a more sophisticated and more difficult to penetrate and to exfiltrate data cybersecurity environment on ourselves. The second area is the international arena of it. That it's not a U.S. on U.S. type crime. It's coming from other countries, and frankly, some of those other countries are looking at state-sponsored cyber attacks, whether it's for IP, as we've read in the Mandiant report, or whether it's going to be used for an offensive or a defensive tool in a failure of diplomatic negotiations. And that kind of international governmental aspect is something as well. Another thing that is very concerning, you have to be very careful about your business partners and where they are located and what they are doing. If you're looking at cloud computing, for example, as many companies are, they need to be very careful as to whom they are outsourcing their cloud computing. Who are those contractors? Where are the servers located? Have you done your due diligence all the way down the line? It's that kind of interconnectivity that really is an advantage of doing work in the internet and the cloud, but at the same time, there's certain threats that you really have to be careful about and watch as those change in the coming few years.
Well, cyber risk to me is one of the true challenges for not only companies, but certainly for the board of directors. They have that oversight responsibility of risk, and a lot of education, I'm afraid, is going to have to go into that. And we just helped in a way with the questions to ask, so I wanted to thank you for joining us today, and that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I want to thank you all for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. Thanks for joining us.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partners, the Center for Audit Quality and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.